Hey everybody, it's your boy. Sorry for no video last week, I just couldn't find the time to record and lots of stuff was going on and I really wanted to talk about them but just couldn't do it. But hey, now I've got a little bit of time today, let's get on ahead and do it, shall we? Obviously today's video was going to be about the Chinese protests going on against the CCP, and this is a topic that I've really been interested in for a couple of years now, which has intensified over the past couple of months. And trust me when I say this, that this is one of the most important events in our lifetime, in our modern era, and I think the ramifications of which we won't live to see, unfortunately. Because let's just say that this is, to quote Tom Nash, a Russian stonks analyst who also dabbles in geopolitics and stuff like that, as he says, this is not the end of the CCP, this is not the end of communist China, but it is the beginning of the end. This is the start of a resistance movement. And I will get into that more as we go on. But trust me when I say this, these are important, this is game changing, and even if they fail today, it's just one battle lost in many more to come. So why are they protesting? Well, contrary to the foreign shills that the CCP like to pay to tell you otherwise, they are actually protesting because of the zero COVID policy. It obviously had its origins in other protests that had things to do with the Foxconn factory and things like that. But really, the spark that lit the fire was a fire in Xinjiang, of all places, and that was because of the zero COVID policy. These people were trapped in their homes, a fire started, nobody could go and help them because the entire area was in lockdown. That was it. That was too far. The Chinese people took to the streets, not just in that area, but everywhere. Every province has had a protest. That is unheard of since 1989 with the Tiananmen Square massacre. When protests happen in China, usually it's a protest that the state approves of. So usually you'll see anti-Japanese protests or something like industrial action. They don't mind that as long as it doesn't affect the CCP. When it does affect the CCP, however minor, they crack down on it hard. You may have seen certain events happen a couple months ago in regards to a scheme that happened where people were finding their money was being taken away from them by banks. There were protests against that, and because that could have potentially affected the CCP, because everything's state-run, they were cracked down hard. Unfortunately, they didn't spread because, well, the CCP, up until now, has done a very good job in isolating people, dividing and conquering. They control the internet to such a degree that is unfathomable, really, to us Westerners. We think our internet is controlled. Theirs is just on another level entirely, yet somehow, through ingenuity, we'll probably find out eventually, somehow, somewhere, the Chinese people who are leading these protests have managed to coordinate in such a way that the CCP didn't see it coming. Even the analysts that I watched, like Serpent ZA, Lao Y86, China Uncensored, they knew that something was going to happen at some point somewhere in the future. They didn't expect it now. They didn't see this coming. None of us did. So that's why they're protesting. And honestly, nobody should be surprised. When you're locked in your home, for 90 days some people have been locked in their apartments. There have been people who've been starving to death. There are people who've been dying of diseases, suicide. And when you take people's food away, even if it's through incompetence, which I think this has mostly been, I don't think the Chinese government have been, for the most part, intentionally starving people. Maybe they have been. It wouldn't surprise me, they're communists. But nonetheless, when all of this is happening, and then finally this horrific event happens in Xinjiang, yeah, you're gonna get riots. You will hear from CCP shills, not only from China but foreigners also, that this is nothing more than Western-inspired civil unrest. It's like a CIA coup. America's involved, Britain's involved, Japan's involved. This is something that's been brewing under the surface of China, not just this past couple of months, but possibly years. And finally, it's happened. But it's not just the zero COVID policy that they're against. They've even been chanting against the CCP and Xi Jinping themselves. This is, again, unprecedented. Usually when they protest, the Chinese people only really chant against the person or the company they have a grievance against, not the CCP. Usually they demand the CCP help them. Even in those protests a few months back against the banks, they were trying to get the CCP to help them, but obviously the CCP had other ideas, and maybe it was their reaction to those protests that red-pilled a lot of people on the government and made them realise that no matter how much of a nationalist they are, no matter how patriotic they are, no matter how loyal they are, the CCP only are loyal to, well, the CCP. And now we finally see thousands of Chinese people have come to the conclusion that yes, actually the CCP is the problem, Xi Jinping is the problem, and they must be physically removed. And it's bad for Xi Jinping, this. This is a loss of face, a terrible loss of face. And as we know, the Chinese and a lot of Asian cultures really value face. He has staked his whole legacy, his reputation on this zero COVID policy. He wants to be the dictator, the president, the chairman, which is what he really wants to be, who destroyed COVID, who ended it, who saved the Chinese people from it, a god amongst them. Well, unfortunately, the zero COVID policy has only ruined his country's economy, which was already failing anyway, but has fast forwarded it. He has killed thousands of people, and as a result of this, unlike most other countries around the world who have had to accept that COVID is now a reality and will have deal with it in measured and normal ways after our own lunacy that we had to deal with, the Chinese haven't moved on from 2020. They are still stuck in that COVIDiot mindset that it must be zero COVID, there must be a QR code society, kind of like what Italy was doing, where if you're unvaxxed, you are isolated. If you're near somebody who's got COVID, you must isolate. In fact, they don't just do it for individuals, but whole sectors. If you're just running around in a shopping mall and you have a QR code and it goes red, you have to stay in that shopping mall and isolate. That's what he created. That was his policy. All these things I've talked about was his idea, and now it's blowing up in front of him. And now, as a result of that, his position is probably incredibly weak. Even when they crack down on these protests, because these protests won't last forever, they will either dissipate because maybe they can't keep the energy up, or the military and the police will crack down so hard that they lose the battle in the streets. It doesn't matter. He's lost face. And he will lose face not to the Chinese public necessarily, but to his own party. As a result of that, there may be manoeuvrings going on behind the scenes, even now as I speak, where perhaps his potential fall will happen. It may not be right now, it may not be in a few months' time, but let's just see what happens next year, maybe the year after, and see if he's still President Xi Jinping. There's a reason why he was trying to purge the party recently, because, well, let's just say he needs to protect himself where shit like this happens. So as I mentioned before, these protests will have ramifications that will go beyond our lifetimes potentially. But what could these be? Well, I think, as Tom Nash said, this is the start of a resistance movement, or at the very least, a massive nationwide one. There's obviously local resistance movements. You have Falun Gong, you have the Uyghurs, you've got, anti-communist groups, but they're all disparate and unconnected and unorganised. This is the first time we've seen since 1989 something organised. I don't know to the extent of how organised it is, but it seems to be very well organised, and it's nationwide. Maybe it'd be something like Solidarity in Poland and Eastern Europe, which formed in, I think, the 50s, 60s, and then gathered momentum in the 70s and 80s, and ultimately ended communism in 89. I think that's something that's obviously going to happen again. I think that you will see that all these anti-communist groups, these pro-freedom groups, will join with some of the ethnic freedom fighters, like in Xinjiang or Uyghur as it's probably called in Tibet, and work to bring down the CCP. But then what will happen after that, if that happens, which I think potentially is going to happen. I think it's a very strong chance in a couple decades' time we won't have the People's Republic of China anymore. We may have the return of the Republic of China, like what Taiwan is. And if that happens, we could see the breakup of certain parts of China, not all of China. I don't think the entire country will break apart like what Russia could potentially do in a couple of years' time after the war. But we will see Tibet gain its independence, I reckon. We will probably see the Uyghurs gain their independence. Will there be a reunification with Taiwan? Well, Taiwan has never really been a part of China, historically. But will there be closer ties? Will they try and mend relationships with Japan and Vietnam and other countries like that? In fact, will that have a positive development on Vietnam and other countries that are peripheral to them? Because Vietnam is also being run by a communist party, but it seems to be a party that seems to be reforming the country, like it's being run by a bunch of Gorbachevs. I may be wrong on that. Or will we see another dictatorship? It may not be a communist dictatorship, maybe something completely different. It could be something like what South Korea and Taiwan had at the start, which will then eventually become democratized, or at the very least less authoritarian. Or it could end up going fascist. We don't know. We have no idea, but all of this could happen when the CCP inevitably loses, which they will. I think in a couple of decades' time, we won't be talking about them much. Now, we can't trust China to be the workshop of the world. This will impact trade, this will impact manufacturing, because now companies around the world and in America, Britain, can no longer afford to have factories in China. Because, well, look at the risks involved in investing there. Unless they're Apple, who are totally invested in the CCP and authoritarianism, they're going to remove those factories and bring them back to where they came from, which is Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and America. They will return these industries here, but there will be a teething problem in the process. There will be many years where we have to essentially retrain the workforce to work in these manufacturing jobs that we no longer have. So that means prices will rise, inflation's going to rise again after the war. But I'd rather that than have the CCP influence our countries via soft power and using their manufacturing base as a result of that, which could result in a lot of geopolitical issues, which it already has done. It's not going to be pretty in the next couple of decades. We won't see the end result of this, unfortunately, I think. We won't be seeing the China that is formed until the 2100s, potentially, maybe a little bit earlier. And it's a shame, because I would really like to see a free China in my lifetime. I'd like to see countries like that throw off the yoke in real time, but I just don't see it. I honestly think that us in the West, who are dealing with the culture wars and stuff, we will resolve most of those issues in our lifetimes way before China is free of the CCP. However, they need to learn one important lesson, and that is to never rest on their laurels. If they win, which I hope they do, I think they will, they need to learn that freedom is something that must be fought for every day. It is not something that once you gain, you have it forever. They, of all people, will probably know that, but it's important that they always stay vigilant and make sure that the next Mao can never rise again, that the next Xi Jinping can't take over. Because if you don't fight for it every single day, because, again, freedom is not free. Liberty is something that you must fight for constantly, and the tree of liberty obviously must always be watered on occasion. Then you will always inevitably fall to authoritarianism and tyranny. So I hope they remember that lesson, because over here in the West, we definitely should have learnt that. But until next time, it's been your boy, and I'll see you all later.